We do not claim ownership over the following video clips and photographs. Sources will be mentioned at the end. Imagine walking through a forest. You can see individuals of different species, plants, and animals that form local populations. Sharing environments and habitats, these plants and animals interact in various ways. Here, a caterpillar is eating the leaf, and larvae are feeding off of the caterpillar. This is the type of interaction we will explore in our video today. So what is a community? A community is simply all of the species living in a particular area interacting either directly or indirectly. We can analyze the structure of a community in two ways. Here are two different communities. One way we can look at these communities is in terms of species richness. This is simply the number of different species. If we compare our two communities, they have the same species richness. Community 1 has 4 different plant species, and Community 2 also has 4 different plant species. However, we can look at species abundance as well. This is the percentage of each species. Here is where the communities differ. In Community 1, there is 25% of each plant species. But in Community 2, Plant A dominates at 80%, while the other species are at a much lower proportion. A single or a few species predominate within a single community. Dominance is the converse of diversity. It is a combination of characteristics that include both abundance and size or biomass of individuals. In the composition of trees in a forest community in central Virginia, red maple and dogwood are dominant in terms of relative abundance. White oak is dominant in terms of relative biomass. In terms of relative abundance, red maple makes up 33%, dogwood makes up 26.4%, while white oak makes 8.8%. In terms of relative biomass, red maple makes up only 6.2%, dogwood only 4.6%, while white oak makes up 58.5%. So what is a keystone species? A perfect example is the sea otter. Keystone species play a major role impacting many other species, even in small numbers. Their role in the community may be to create or modify habitats, or to influence the interactions among other species. Sea urchins eat up kelp. Kelps are a major source of food and shelter for the ecosystem. If sea otters didn't feed on sea urchins, the ecosystem would collapse. To better understand this, let's watch a video by pewmarinefellows.org.
So when you're watching sea otters, you're probably watching them eat because they have an incredible warm fur, but they don't have a lot of blubber. So what that means is metabolically, they need to eat a lot. So when you're watching sea otters, they're generally eating or digesting.
Cute, right? But here's where the problem comes in.
With the fur trade that happened in the 18th and 19th century, it eliminated one of the top predators, sea otters. And with that came this cascade of indirect effects. All of the prey that sea otters ate could all of a sudden increase in numbers and even in size. And people on the coast then became increasingly reliant on these shellfish for food to feed their families, for livelihoods, for their jobs.
Now listen carefully to how this affected the kelp.
With the increase in some of these shellfish fisheries came the erosion of kelp forests, because one of those major shellfish are sea urchins. So as soon as you start messing with sea urchins, you have dramatic changes from kelp forest systems to urchin-bearing systems.
Species interactions can be explained by food webs. Acquiring energy and nutrients required for assimilation is the most fundamental process in nature. Structure of communities often focus on feeding relationships among species and how they interact to acquire energy necessary for metabolism, growth, and reproduction. Food chain is a descriptive diagram representing the flow of energy from the prey to the predator by using a series of arrows. Food webs are highly interwoven and with linkages, representing the complex interactions of predator and prey. Let me show you another video clip to better explain these two concepts.
In every ecosystem, living things are linked by the food they eat and the energy they get from the food. These links taken together make up the food web. Food chains within these webs often involve predator and prey relationships. The grasslands of Serengeti National Park in Tanzania are home to a great diversity of animals, each dependent on the next for survival. Here, where the climate is dry and the soil is poor, grass collects energy from the sun and kicks off each food chain. Plant eaters like these gazelles feed on the grass, and in doing so, they help even more grass grow back in its place. The large number of plant-eating animals found in the Serengeti provides food for many predators. Large predators need to eat less frequently than other animals because their bodies use up energy at a much slower rate. Anything they leave behind gets broken down and eventually returned to the soil as nutrients for plants. The food chain always starts as photosynthesis and ends in decay.
Basal species feed on no other species and they are prey for other species. Intermediate species feed on other species, but they are also prey to other species. Top predators, on the other hand, are not subject to other predators. They prey on the intermediate and basal species. Ecologists often simplify the representation of food webs by lumping species into broader categories called trophic levels. Autotroph, or primary producers, derive energy from the sun. Heterotrophs, or secondary producers, derive energy from consuming plants or animals. Heterotrophs are subdivided into herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Take a look at this next clip by MakeMeGenius.com.
Plants are only living species who make their own food. They use sunlight, carbon dioxide from air, and water from soil to make their food. This process is called photosynthesis. So now you know plants make their own food. All other species like animals and we humans are dependent on plants. Now see, a giraffe is coming. It is eating the plant. Species who only eat plant are called herbivores. Oh, what is happening? A lion is coming. Oh, it is attacking the giraffe. Oh, it has killed the giraffe and is eating it. Species which eat other animals are called carnivores. So you have seen plants make their own food. Other animals eat plants, and some other animals eat those animals who eat plants. So all are dependent on plants. This is also called food chain. It starts from plants. In food chain, plants are known as producers as they produce food. The species who eat plants are called primary consumers, and the species who eat species dependent on plants are called secondary consumers. Now, there is one more part of this food chain. These are fungi and bacteria in soil. When animals die, these fungi and bacteria in soil decompose their dead bodies. They become nutrients. These nutrients again are used by plants to make food. See here, when lion dies, its body is decomposed in soil by bacteria and fungi, and it turns into nutrients. Then, these are again used by plants. These fungi and bacteria are called decomposers. Decomposers are an important part of food chain. Let us see other food chain. Here, rat eats acorns fruit, which comes from plant, and snake eats rats. Eagle eats rat. Eagle dies. It gets decomposed, and plants use decomposed nutrients to produce fruit. The food chains which we saw, which have one producer, one primary consumer, and one secondary consumer, are called simple food chains. Actually, life is not so simple. Look at this picture. This is very complex. Look at the rat. It can be eaten by cat also, or it may be eaten by snake. Plant can be eaten by goat or by rabbit. These kind of complex food chains are called food web, as they are very interconnected.
Species within a community can be classified into functional groups. A guild is a group of populations that utilize a gradient of resources in a similar way. Guilds have a strong interspecific competition, but weaker interactions with the remainder of their community. Functional type is now commonly used to define a group of species based on their common response to the environment, life history, characteristics, or role within the community. An example is the grouping of animals into the categories of Heteroporous and Semelparous based on the timing of reproductive effort. Semelparous organisms such as the salmon reproduce once and die. This is known as Big Bang reproduction. Heteroporous organisms, on the other hand, are able to reproduce multiple times. Functional groups allow ecologists to simplify the structure of a community into manageable units for study and to ask basic questions about the factors that structure communities as well. So what are the factors? Zonation is the categorization of biomes into zones based on their distribution or arrangement in a habitat, as determined by environmental factors such as altitude, latitude, and other biotic factors. Zonation can also be defined as the broad distribution of vegetation according to latitude and altitude. Primarily, the climate controls the distribution of the vegetation in a specific area. When it comes to zonation in areas where water is present, usually the salinity, wind velocity, and mechanical influence of moving sand particles are the factors that are considered. Zonation and succession are two concepts easily confused by people, but the main difference between them is the difference in time versus space. They both show a change in the community. However, zonation shows us a change over a distance, whereas succession shows us a change over time. One of the classic examples of zonations are rocky shores and intertidal areas. As we can see, we have two marks on a typical rocky shore. We have a high tide and we have a low tide. In between there, what we're going to see is a change from organisms that are more salt and water tolerant to organisms that are less salt and water tolerant. So we see a change in the species of plants and animals as we go higher and away from the water. This is a picture of Newport Beach in Rhode Island. Here you can really see the difference between the colors of the rocks. If you look down near the water, you'll see that the rocks are very dark in color. That's because they have a lot of algae, because they are submerged in water at least twice a day. If you go higher up, you'll see that the rocks are whiter in color. This is because the rocks are not typically submerged in water. There are some times where they might become submerged, for instance, very high tides, as a result of moon phases or storms. But in general, these rocks are not covered during the twice-a-day fluctuation in the lower rocks. So, as you go further upwards, you can see the amount and height of trees vary, partly because of their gradient and partly because the taller trees are less salt tolerant than species such as shrubs. Another classic example of zonation is the change in altitude. So what we see is as we go higher up along the mountain, we notice different communities that are going to have different amounts and kinds of vegetations. The picture on the left is a sample rocky mountain with evident vegetation change. You first see traditional pine trees, and as you go up the mountain, look at where you see different changes in the zones and colors. When you get to the very top, there is very little plant life. There might be some lichens or mosses up there, but notice that the rocks are covered in snow rather than vegetation. Now let's watch a video clip on succession.
Succession is a change in the community over time. So the picture above is what we call secondary succession. And this is where a previous community has been established, but it's been destroyed. Wildfire is usually the common cause of it. Sometimes it's even things like we had a forest, we cut the trees down in order to log them or to create farmland, and then if we leave them alone, we'll come back and there'll be a different setting or a different community later on. So secondary succession is when there was a previous community and it was destroyed, and that's different from primary succession, where it's a previously uncolonized area, so it's only bare rock, there's nothing else there. This usually happens after things like glacier retreat or after lava flows happen. The first stage in succession, whether it's primary or secondary, is called the pioneer stage. And in this pioneer community, we have species that are very hardy, and that means they're able to withstand tough conditions, such as low nutrients, lack of soil, maybe there's an increase in salinity, there's not as much precipitation, the temperature fluctuates rapidly throughout the day, so it's just an area where not many things can survive. In this community, what we typically see are lichens or mosses, and these pioneer species help to set the area for the next group of species that are going to come in. And they do this because when those pioneer species die, they start to put nutrients into the area and they help to create soil through that process of decomposition. They also can increase the ground temperature by going through the biological processes of photosynthesis and respiration. So the next wave of species that come in this case we're looking at pictures 5 and 6, we start to see things that are better suited to survive in that area. When those die out, they again add to the soil, and that leads to bigger trees and different kinds of, going from conifers to deciduous trees, so from the pine trees to your typical flowering trees that you think about. They go through another final stage to our climax community, and this is where we have our community set with the tall trees, some shrubs in there, but we have a different community than what we started with in previous stages. So again, our typical model of succession is we start with nothing. We have colonization by our lichens. Those in turn weather the rock. We produce dead organic material, so we help to create the soil. Mosses come in, there's more weathering, we get more soil coming around. Then we have small plants such as grasses and ferns, which again continue and improve the soil. We get larger plants that grow deeper, creating more soil again. And finally, we have our climax community that's dominated by our shrubs and trees.
This is an example of secondary succession. On the left, we have a forest 1 year after a fire, and on the right is the same forest 2 years after the fire. Take a look at the ground and the plants that are starting to come back. Our pioneer species like lichens, mosses, and small grasses, they survive because they don't need much soil. They help transform an area wherein ferns can come in. If we come back to this area in another 5 to 10 years, we will be able to see taller plants and more shrubs start to come in. This is an example of primary succession. So this is a lava flow in Hawaii. In between are green patches. Those are ferns. They have been able to come in and start to establish themselves after the lichens and mosses. This is what primary succession looks like. We have bare rock. There is no soil. Eventually, the lichens, mosses, and smaller shrubs will create a different community. Let's watch another video clip on succession.
Productivity changes, as does biodiversity and amount of soil, and the types of nutrient cycles that we have change over time in conjunction with our successions. So in the early stage of succession, our gross productivity is low because we just have a lack of producers, because we don't have soil, we don't have nutrients, we don't have enough water. But we have a lot of energy that's not lost through respiration, so as a result our net productivity is high. When we have high net productivity, we have an accumulation of biomass. In later stages, our gross productivity is high because we have more consumers, and it's balanced out by respiration. So as we get to our climax community, we start to see a 1 ratio. So we have equal amounts of net and gross productivity, so we're not really adding more biomass. You can also see, if you look at the bottom of this graph, the amount of biodiversity, biomass, and soil layer also increases over time. In the early stages, we have a low biodiversity because we don't have suitable habitats. But again, as these pioneer communities die out and start to form the soil, bigger trees can come in, ferns, start with ferns, bigger organisms can come in because we'll have more suitable habitats and more suitable niches for them to fall into.
An example of a major biome and their vegetation is the taiga or boreal forest. They are mainly composed of coniferous evergreens. Another example are the temperate rainforests. A kind of temperate rainforest is the evergreen, which contains mainly spruces. Another kind is the deciduous forest, which contains mainly oaks. And also, we have temperate rainforest, which contains sequoias. Then there are the tropical rainforests. They have the greatest biological diversity. They have vines, orchids, palms, and more. Tropical rainforests are complex and can be divided into 4 distinct strata, representing zones of different vegetation. The strata are canopy, subcanopy, understory, and ground layer. So how are community boundaries defined? How different must 2 adjacent areas be before we call them separate communities? Transition zones are characterized by a profound change in the composition of plant and animal communities. These changes may be abrupt or gradual. Ecologists use various sampling and statistical techniques to classify communities. However, classification of communities involves a degree of subjectivity depending on study objectives and spatial scale. Consider forest zonations. A zonation is a complex pattern related to elevation, slope position, and exposure. Darren Gedge's Geography channel discusses New Zealand as an example.
Our case study is the magnificent landscape of the Tongariro National Park in New Zealand. This landscape has numerous volcanoes, including Mount Tongariro, Mount Narahoe, and Mount Ruapehu. The first pattern I want to cover is that of altitudinal zonation. This diagram shows the zones of different forest types found in New Zealand as altitude increases. At high altitudes, vegetation types are generally shorter and sparser. Plant life gets shorter and sparser until eventually only ice and snow is found on the bare rocks. At lower altitudes, the climate is generally warmer, so the vegetation is characterized by large forest trees.
Altitudes and elevations dictate species distribution along a community. Names suggest the dominant tree species. These large-scale examples of zonation list important points in the examination of processes responsible for spatial changes. As we move from a hilltop to a valley, the structure of a community differs. Scientists of the 20th century implied processes that are responsible for structuring communities. The key phenomenon, as botanists term it, is association. For example, the existence of clusters or species is an indication of either a positive or negative interaction. Nebraskan botanist Frederick Clements proposed the idea of the organismic concept of a community. This organismic concept likened associations to organisms, which represented interactions and integrated components of the whole. In contrast, H.A. Gleason's idea of community states that relationships among coexisting species is a result of similarities in their requirements and tolerances and not in interactions, calling it the individualistic concept. Now let's move on to climax communities.
Succession concludes with a relatively stable climax community. Traveling around the Earth, the types of climax community vary dramatically from one area to another. For example, The northeast coast of Australia is blanketed by an ancient rainforest. Climax desert communities populate much of the southwestern United States, while savannas, holding an incredible diversity of animal life, spread across much of Central Africa. The exact nature of the climax community is determined by numerous geological and climatic variables, including temperature, rainfall, elevation, latitude, type of rock, which influences the type of nutrients available, exposure to sun and wind, and many more factors, including human activity. For example, human activities have dramatically altered the climax vegetation in large tracts of the American West. By overgrazing cattle on western grasslands, ranchers have enabled sagebrush, which cattle refuse to eat, to outcompete the native grasses, which cattle have been allowed to graze and trample to the point of destruction. Once the sagebrush takes hold, grasses are unable to regain their dominant position in the climax community.
On the other hand, subclimax communities require work.
Some ecosystems are not allowed to reach the climax stage, but are rather maintained in the subclimax stage. The tall grass prairie that once covered northern Missouri and Illinois is actually a subclimax of an ecosystem whose climax community is deciduous forest. The prairie was maintained by periodic fires, some set by lightning and others deliberately set by Native Americans to increase grazing land for buffalo. Forest now encroaches on most tall grass prairies, and limited prairie preserves that remain are maintained by carefully managed burning. Agriculture also depends on the artificial maintenance of carefully selected subclimax communities. Grains are specialized grasses characteristic of early successional stages, and much of a farmer's energy goes into preventing competitors like weeds and shrubs from taking hold in agricultural fields. Likewise, suburban lawns, golf courses, and athletic fields are also subclimax ecosystems that require painstaking maintenance to keep crabgrass, dandelions, and other successional invaders at bay.
And that concludes our discussion on community structure.